Hi, everyone, and welcome to Live with the 19th, a brand new virtual event series that gives you a front row seat to conversations with women on the front lines of politics and public policy. I'm Emily Ramshaw, co-founder and CEO of The 19th, a nonprofit, nonpartisan news platform launching late this summer at the intersection of gender, politics, and policy. Events like this one aren't possible without the support of the 19th sponsors. Thanks so much to Bumble, a connections app designed to help you make meaningful connections in love, life, and work. Download Bumble now to start making virtual connections in all aspects of your life. Just want to add that while donors and sponsors generously support our programming, they do not play a role in selecting the topics, the speakers, or the line of questioning. I am absolutely thrilled today to introduce this conversation between the 19th's editor-at-large, Errin Haines, and leader Stacey Abrams, the 2018 Georgia gubernatorial candidate, voting rights activist, and oft-mentioned contender for Joe Biden's vice presidential shortlist. Thank you both for joining us, and Errin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Emily, and thank you for joining us for our very first Live at the 19th event. Just a couple of housekeeping notes before we get started, because we're really excited for you to share with the 19th with your friends. You can ask questions by tweeting hashtag the 19th Live or by leaving a comment at facebook.com/19th News. And you can get notified about future events by visiting 19thnews.org/subscribe. And with that, let's get into our conversation with 2018 Georgia gubernatorial nominee and romance novelist and VP possible contender, leader Stacey Abrams. Leader Abrams, good morning. Thank you so much for joining us. It's so good to be with you.
Thanks for having me.
Well, listen, I just want to start by asking you, you're in the same situation as millions of Americans, quarantined. How are you and your family really faring in this pandemic? And what can you say about the coronavirus threat in Georgia now that the state is reopening?
Well, I first want to say thank you for having me, and I hope that everyone watching is safe and healthy and that your families are doing well. I'm privileged to have most of my family here in Georgia now. My parents moved here last summer. I have a brother in California, sister in Kentucky. Everyone else is safely here and everyone's doing well. The benefit and the blessing that we have is not something that's shared by everyone. The state of Georgia now has more than 30,000 cases of COVID that have been confirmed, a case in every single one of our counties. And we have 159 counties. We have a death rate that's a little over 1,300 people, and the majority of those deaths are African-American. There has been some preemptive celebration by the governor and his supporters that his reopening of the state has led to declines, but it ignores the science that says that, yes, there are waves, and waves typically have a dip before they go back up. And one of the challenges is the incubation time for COVID. It's 14 days, which means that we are likely to see, based on the science and based on the increased interactions, we are likely to see another spike. We are also learning every single day that there are new symptoms and new consequences of COVID-19. And this is just a very dangerous endeavor. I will give credit that we are seeing increased testing availability in the state of Georgia, but this is a state of more than 10.5 million people. And just 2 weeks ago and a week ago, we were number 7 in terms of the slowest and lowest amount of testing. And so while it's good that we have more, we are not nearly at the place we need to be to safely reopen, and more importantly, to put people's lives at risk for the vain notion that we can reopen an economy without consumers who can benefit from participation.
Yeah, I mean, what would you say that Governor Kemp needs to do now to keep Georgians safe? And what are you doing to try to address this threat for folks, particularly rural folks down in Southwest Georgia? I know you've paid a lot of attention and have tried to raise awareness around what's going on down there.
I think that the governor has to continue to lift up the science and not simply the wish list of politicians. Yes, we have seen a dip, a decline, a minor decline in the number of cases, which he touted yesterday, or someone touted on his behalf. And the problem is that wasn't followed with the science and the facts that say that there will be spikes when more people are back in the environment, more people are engaging, when social distancing is cut, it increases the likelihood of infection. We know in Hokkaido, Japan, a state that, an area that followed all the rules, They reopened, they were doing great, and then they had a second wave that hit harder than the first. And my deep worry is that because he's not adding science and fact to his cheerleading of the economy, he is putting more people in danger. The work I'm doing has been focusing on, as you said, the least resilient and the most vulnerable populations. And here in Georgia, that's in Southwest Georgia. At one point during this pandemic, that area was number 4 in the world for COVID infections. And so I've done a few things. We are holding regular calls with hundreds of folks down in Southwest Georgia, making sure they have the science, they have the facts. We invite doctors and practitioners to be on those calls to help provide information and support, because this is a community that also lacks access to the internet for a lot of pockets of the most vulnerable. In addition, through my organization, the Southern Economic Advancement Project, we are going to deliver more than 40,000 pounds of shelf-stable food to pantries in Southwest Georgia, Southeast Alabama, and Northwest Florida, because our mission is to ensure that those communities have the food they need, particularly given that food insecurity, is now at one of the highest rates that we have ever seen in our country for children. It's 1 in 5. And we know that this small amount of food, it can serve about 800,000 meals, that this means that we can help at least start to address the issue of food insecurity, but more remains to be done. And so the last thing I'm a part of is Project 100, which is helping to move money directly into the hands of people, especially in Southwest Georgia, who are not getting their stimulus checks because they're SNAP beneficiaries. They don't have banks and they don't file taxes, which means they are unlikely to get those stimulus dollars that would be so important and have such a great impact on their lives.
Yeah. I know that you were also focused on, frankly, how we can have safe elections in the midst of this pandemic as well. And I want to ask you about that, because I know that you were already working on voter access, expanding the electorate, and frankly, fighting voter suppression in this 2020 election. But I want to hear from you more about how that has changed for you in this pandemic, and really how the pandemic is a threat to access to the ballot.
So in 2018, when I did not become governor, I had a choice. I could either wait for the next seat to run for, or I could focus on fixing what I saw as a broken system. And while Georgia was a singular example of voter suppression, we were not alone. I created 2 organizations under the umbrella of Fair Fight Action, which is our C4 organization, and Fair Fight 2020, which is our national work. We have 43 staffers in 18 states. We're in 18 states and we've got 43 staffers, and our work is to ensure that voter access exists in those states. We knew there would be something catastrophic that happened for the elections in 2020, based on what we saw happen to us in 2018, based on what we knew about 2016, and based on the fact that Republicans, for the first time in 40 years, are able to use the Republican National Committee to participate in voter suppression activities using both hard and soft dollars. And we've seen evidence of that already. But what I also understood was that we didn't know what the nature of the catastrophe would be. I did not expect a pandemic, but what we were building for was something that would try to collapse our access to our democracy. And that's why I'm so proud of the work that we've been able to do across this country, because we were prepared. We had staff in place in 2019. We've been scaling it up and doing the training, and we saw it work. We saw it work in Wisconsin, where we were working shoulder to shoulder with Ben Wickler, the chair of the party, the Democratic Party in Wisconsin, as well as our voter protection director, Dave Kronig. And because of that work, we were able to help thousands of Wisconsinites get access to their ballots and get the information they need. In fact, we know that because of mail-in ballots and because the postmark date was what was permitted, not the date of return, more than 100,000 extra ballots were counted that may have been otherwise discounted. But we also know that there are a number of traps that are in place right now across the country, where because of the work we're doing with Fair Fight in conjunction with other organizations, we are fighting hard to make certain that bureaucratic hurdles do not block voters from having access to their elections. The last thing I'll say is this. We know that there are gold standards for how we can vote by mail in 2020. Those gold standards are not hard. 1, the ballot should be postage paid. People should not have to try to hunt down a stamp in order to vote. Number 2, it should be postmarked for delivery, not the day of delivery, because delivery is slow. Mail delivery is slow. And with the attacks we see on the Postal Service, we don't know what's going to be in play by November. And so we need federal action to say that people have access. Number three, we know that signatures have been used to disqualify people's ballots, and we're fighting to make sure that doesn't happen. And we are working to make sure that people have the ability, especially community groups like Native Americans on reservations, have the ability to collect their ballots and deliver them, because it's going to be difficult, but we can get this done if we have vote by mail, in-person early voting, and in-person voting on the day of.
Yeah, I know, getting that process started now would put us in a much better position for November, but obviously Georgia is less than a month away from its primary, which is scheduled to happen, I believe, June 9th. Can you talk to me about how prepared you feel like Georgia, both of our, where we both have roots, how prepared is Georgia for the primary that's coming up here in just a few weeks?
Georgia's still grappling with some technical issues, but I am pleased that we were able to reach a bipartisan agreement a few months ago when the date was moved first to May and then to June. There was negotiation between the Democratic Party and the Republican Secretary of State to ensure that every active voter in Georgia received an absentee ballot application. That's 6.9 million active voters. Unfortunately, that left out those who were newly registered or who'd been put on the inactive list, but it was a major start. We know the challenge, however, the issue and the hurdles that we still remain are, one, the issue that Georgia is one of the worst states for signature mismatches. And that, again, is when your signature is compared to something else you've signed and it's used as a predicate for throwing out your ballot. Scientists will tell you, forensic scientists will tell you that signature matches, it's junk science. It doesn't actually prove anything, but it makes administrators feel better. And so we reached a consent decree with the state of Georgia to have a better standard and a better process. The second issue, though, is lack of postage. Georgia has more than 100 counties that are considered rural. And so there's still deep concerns about whether people have access to the stamps they need to be able to mail their ballots back. And the fact that Georgia is one of the states that requires that your ballot be received by Election Day, not postmarked by Election Day. Luckily, there was a lawsuit filed through the New Georgia Project that is challenging that errant standard, and hopefully that will be rectified. It will not likely happen by June, although we're hopeful, but we're certainly making sure that this is something that's dealt with before November. And we have had some issues with the envelopes. The instructions say that there should be an outer and an inner envelope, but the vendor only included an outer envelope. And so there was some confusion, and our organization has been working hard with the affected parties and with other groups to make sure people have good information about how this process works. The challenge, though, and I'm going to add one last piece. There was bipartisan agreement that vote by mail was necessary. But as I pointed out, this is the first year that there has been the ability for coordination among the Republican National Committee and other groups to try to intimidate voters. And so concomitant to agreeing to allow people to get these ballots, and that, I give the Secretary of State credit, he also created a voter fraud detection team, which essentially was designed to intimidate voters who wanted to use vote by mail. And that's particularly effective here in Georgia because the prior Secretary of State, current Governor Brian Kemp, arrested 12 people in 2010, charged them with 120 felonies for the use of absentee ballots. They did not commit a crime. They were exonerated of all charges, but the fear remains. And so the threat of having someone accuse you of a crime, put you in jail, cost you your job, cost you your reputation, we worry that this is going to have a depressive effect on people's willingness to use absentee ballots. And so Fair Fight Action has been doing hard work across the state to make sure people understand that it is safe to vote by mail in Georgia.
Yeah, the psychological effect of voter suppression is something that you and I have talked about quite a bit. And I'm glad that you brought up Quitman, Georgia, where you recently were, and where I wrote about your experience returning there in the profile that's out about you today that I wrote, and that's in the Washington Post. I want to ask one more question about Georgia, obviously back in the spotlight for another reason, the Ahmaud Arbery case, which you have been outspoken about in recent days. So Georgia's Attorney General is now requesting that the Department of Justice investigate the handling of the Arbery case. And you talk about why elections matter and the consequences of why, who we choose to represent us at the local, state, and national level. So my question is, What are your thoughts on this case and the Attorney General's request? And how do you see the safety of African Americans as a ballot issue in 2020?
We know that African Americans are disproportionately affected by the horrific misapplication of justice and the misapplication of vengeance, which is even more, I think, the challenge. This was about vigilantes, two men who thought they saw something, and more importantly, thought they had the right to take a man's life in order to pursue their hunch. It was vicious, it was mean, it was uncalled for, and it was murder. But what happened after is what should also be deeply concerning. The district attorney declined to take action. A second district attorney declined to take action. And it took this national push to force the third district attorney to acknowledge that this had to be done. But it took the Georgia Bureau of Investigation to actually execute an arrest warrant. Those are steps that should not be necessary when a man is killed in cold blood in broad daylight. But what it draws to mind for me is the reality that our ability to interfere with this miscarriage of justice begins at the ballot box. Our ability to intercede and to say, this is what we demand, begins at the ballot box. And that's the ability to elect DAs, district attorneys who actually believe in justice for all that they serve. Number two, it's the ability to serve on those juries. And in Georgia, you have to be registered to vote to sit on a jury panel, including a grand jury, which was the fail-safe that the third district attorney said he was going to use in order to effectuate justice. I believe that we have to see all of these things as interconnected. We live in a nation that is governed by representative democracy. We pick people to speak for us. And if we are not able to cast a ballot, if we are not able to register to vote, then we are pushed out of the system and our voices are silenced. I grew up in southern Mississippi. I live in Georgia. I believe in the possibility of our nation, but I also believe in the responsibility of our people to hold those elected leaders accountable, and when they fail to do their job, to remove them from office.
Yeah. Well, there were a lot of questions about this from our audience, and so we're going to have to get to the Veep stakes conversation. I want to start though, because during the primary election, you were neutral amid the very crowded field of candidates, and you did not endorse anybody for the Democratic presidential nomination. And I guess while your expressed desire to be vice president could be seen as an endorsement of Vice President Biden, I just want to put the question to you directly. Do you and will you publicly and officially endorse Vice President Biden as the presumptive Democratic nominee for president in 2020?
Absolutely. So let's be clear. When I began the work of Fair Fight 2020, we had to go into 20 states. We started in 2019. So we had 4 states that were already having elections statewide, and we intended to expand to 16 other states for a total of 20 states. To do that work, I had to secure the support of local elected officials, state level elected officials, and federal officials, as well as every Democratic nominee or every Democratic candidate running for president. I had to talk to every single one of them. And to do that work, to enlist their support for what was an unprecedented level of voter protection apparatus put in place before the primaries even began, meant that I had to promise neutrality, because I could not be seen, and the work we did could not be seen as the arm of any campaign. Our mission is to protect democracy, and we're using the Democratic Party capacity to be embedded in election apparatus to get this work done. But I am pleased that Vice President Biden is the presumptive nominee. He has my full support, and my responsibility has been to make sure that we maintained not only my neutrality, but our effectiveness through this primary structure. And once that was clearly accomplished, I was very pleased to let Vice President know and others know of my support.
Okay, we got that cleared up. Like I mentioned, your interest in the vice presidency is well known at this point. But what I want to talk to you about is why this conversation matters, whether Vice President selects you as his running mate or not. Because you've been criticized by some people who say that your approach to the role is unorthodox. And as I wrote in my profile of you today, you are creating a playbook for how a Black woman positions herself for such a role, since there has never been a Black woman nominated for vice president. So talk about why it's important for you to make the case for why you would make a good choice on the 2020 ticket, and how that helps change the conversation around who is electable.
Well, let's begin with the fact that I've been getting this question for 14 months. I've been getting it since March 2019. And if you look at my answer every single time, it has never changed. People famously remember my very straightforward comment that you don't run for second place in a primary, but they ignore the comma and the second part of my statement, which was that I would be, if I declined to run myself, I would certainly be open to the possibility of running as the running mate of whomever the nominee was. And I have never wavered from that statement. I have made it every time a reporter has asked, every time I've been asked in a forum. So for 14 months, I've given the same answer. It's only that people have cared about the answer in the last 3 weeks. And that, I think, has shifted the spotlight. But the reason I've given an unequivocal answer every time for the last 14 months is exactly what you laid out. As a woman of color, as a person of color, as a Black woman, I speak not only for myself, but I speak to the questions that are often asked about the capacity of women to do, the capacity of Black women to be qualified, the ability to attain roles and powers in positions of leadership when you don't look like what's come before. Because let's think about this. If there are only two pathways, senator or governor, there's never been a Black woman governor in American history. There have only ever been 15 Black women elected to statewide office outside of the US Senate, and there have only been 2 Black women senators. And so if there are only 2 tracks, then we are going to be excluded from consideration unless we declare that we have to think more broadly about not the title, but the work, the qualifications and the capacity. And so I don't speak simply for myself. I speak for every person who has had to find atypical and unorthodox ways to get the work done, because the work does not care about your title. It cares about your intention, your actions, and your deliverables.
Yeah. Well, I think on that note, I want to go to some questions from the audience, because people had interest in a range of things. I mean, voter participation in the primary, the Veep stakes, and even your future, what's next for Selena Montgomery. They're very interested in your romance novel.
Bring it on.
What's up next for that? So, one question, given that this year is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, we've got a question from Dr. Shawnee Horowitz-Rosen of Presskill, who asks, what do you think should be the next constitutional amendment?
We have to pass a constitutional amendment authorizing the right to vote and guaranteeing it. We have to recognize that all power in a democracy begins with access to the ballot. That's what the 19th Amendment fought for. It's what the 15th Amendment declared, although it was vitiated by Jim Crow and Dred Scott, until we had, luckily, the advent of the Voting Rights Act. It's what the 26th Amendment guaranteed for young people. But with every one of those amendments, the federal government delegated to the states the administration of elections. And when you delegate to the very bad actors who have prevented access the authority to set up the obstacles to gaining access, we should never be surprised by the continuation of voter suppression. I believe that we have to have a democratic, and I mean small d, democratic constitutional amendment that guarantees a floor that says you cannot pass laws at the state level below which this serves as a qualification for people to serve as electors in our nation. I believe if we can do that, if we can guarantee the right to vote, that should be made real. I support the ERA amendment, and I'm gratified that we have seen that movement continue. And so my assumption is that this will slide in right behind it. But if I had to put another amendment on the table, it would be an amendment to guarantee access to the right to vote, because that is the amendment that then makes every other action we see, every other moment of progress we see as necessary, possible in our country.
Yeah. I have another question here asking how voters can push Congress for more mail-in voting at the federal level.
So I'm very gratified to see that Speaker Nancy Pelosi has advocated very intentionally for including the additional resources in the CARES package. This must be done in the next CARES stimulus package that is going to move. This is a country that's already passed 15% unemployment, and we're heading skyward, which means there's going to be federal action taken. We cannot wait to include the dollars necessary to protect the right to vote. And if we push for the CARES package to include 3 things, one is vote by mail, and that vote by mail means that it has to be postage paid, that it has to be postmarked appropriately, and that the signature mismatch laws cannot be misused. But we also have to have in-person early voting and in-person voting the day of. because we have to remember that there are those who, no matter what they want, cannot vote but in person. That means those who are disabled, those who have language barriers, a number of people who live on reservations for whom in-person voting is the only option. We know that there are those who've been displaced, who are homeless, and those who simply do not have the ability to participate and vote by mail or have been rejected. And so we want all of those people to be able to participate in our election in 2020. And that means federal action now. Because as I said earlier, we are not a nation that allows the federal government to set the floor for our elections. There are 50 different states and territories that set the rules. We need a federal law that recognizes that a pandemic is a singular moment in our history, and we have to get it done. The last thing I'll say is this. South Korea just had a national election where they elected their entire national team, their entire legislature. They started experiencing COVID at the same time as the United States, and they managed to achieve the highest level of voter participation that they've seen in 30 years. If South Korea can do it, so can the United States.
Well, like I said, the Selena Montgomery question is out there, and I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to go ahead and ask you anyway. Will there be a new romance novel coming out, and could it be based in the White House?
If there is a new Selena Montgomery novel, it will be the third book in the trilogy that I started back in 2008 that I was unable to complete because I started a new company and I became minority leader in Georgia in 2010, and that sort of scuttled my writing. I hope to get back to it because I have siblings, mainly my mom and my sister, and a couple of cousins who I don't think will allow me to come home for another holiday if I don't get it done. So that's going to be next on my list.
Well, you do have a new book coming out, and I want to give you a second to just kind of talk about that. What is the book about? When is it coming out? What's the name of it? And when can folks get it?
So Our Time Is Now is the name of the book, and it focuses on the history of voter suppression and the reality of suppression in the 21st century. I also talk about the importance of the census. This is something that we tend to overlook when we think about voter suppression and voter access, but the census is how we allocate $1.5 trillion a year, but also how we allocate power in our legislative districts from school board all the way to Congress. And if we don't pay attention, we will face for the next decade a repeat of what we've seen. And I would put sharp attention on the fact that in communities, especially communities of color, that are not receiving the resources they need, that are facing under-resourced beds and inability to access PPE, schools that don't have the resources they need, that's the direct result to undercounting communities of color, low-income communities, and rural communities in the last census. But I also take the time to talk about what's next. How do we fix our democracy? How do we acknowledge the diversity that is America today? And how do we use identity, not as a weapon to be wielded against us, but as a moment of power so we can assert our opportunity to be part of the conversation? As women, as people of color, as the marginal and disadvantaged, but also as people who have the right to be heard in our government. Because let's be clear, identity politics didn't start now. It started at the inception of our country when specific communities were excluded from participation. And lastly, I offer a prescription for who we can be if we do this right. And so Our Time Is Now is going to be available in bookstores starting June 9th, and I encourage everyone to pick it up and read it. If you want to do it by Audible, I think that comes out early at the end of May. But I encourage everyone to go and get Our Time Is Now.
Well, there we have it. Listen, Leader Abrams, I cannot thank you enough for helping us to kick off our Live with the 19th event series. I so appreciate you being in this conversation today. Thank you for being with us, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Errin. Thank you all.
And thank you for being such a great audience, for asking such awesome questions. And we really want to hear your feedback on what you thought of today's series, but also for ideas that you have on who could be speakers for our future series. Thank you for paying attention. I'm Errin Haines, editor-at-large at the 19th. And with that, I'll pass it back to our CEO, Emily Ramshaw, to talk about our next event.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Errin, and thank you, Leader Abrams, for that terrific conversation. Thank you also to Bumble for making this event possible. I hope we'll see you all back here on Friday, May 22nd, for the second event in this series, which is a conversation with GOP Chair Ronna McDaniel and 19th Washington correspondent Amanda Becker. I just want to remind you all that the 19th is a member-supported newsroom. If you enjoyed this programming today, we hope that you will subscribe to our free newsletter and consider becoming a founding member of the 19th at 19thnews.org. Thank you again. We look forward to seeing you back here next time. Bye-bye.